But the shit isn't even working. Everything. That's just so much over that by. I've been doing this bitch 100 days because we're pants. My shit.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is to handle on just how ideas developed over time. It's tempting to think that Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah from the point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel and to the rise of modern Hasidism in the 18th century. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully will also enable you to develop into Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and in the Old and New Testament primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are.
Maybe not tiny.
Let me express my gratitude to you for allowing me to use these features to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks, or you can find these episodes after autumn of 2021 and you want to watch this entire series, you can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I hope you check out my other content on topics of esotericism, and perhaps consider production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism, hermetic philosophy, by joining my Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. Now, let's enter the gardens of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Folks, well, welcome back. We're getting into, in some ways, the high watermark of the Kabbalah Tanakh. I say the high watermark because it's like Luria's formulation of Kabbalah has basically become Jewish theology. And that's something I think that you can't really shake a stick at that. It's a really incredible thing that fundamentally one God in many ways formulated how Jews all over the world understand the world that they live in, and it's a glorious version of the Kabbalah. It's deeply embedded in Judaism that, like Tikkun Olam, phrase that I bet now in this class is heard 1,000 times. Shuls have given a long commitment. This idea directly commits Gloria. So many ideas that emerge from Gloria. So tonight we'll get to his ideas. Now I'm not going to exhaust him to deal with his ideas. First, and even the books that remain in Hebrew are so difficult that often in regions of people still not know quite what the world's going on. Very, very difficult. And part of how Gloria's Kabbalah develops was people trying to make sense of what the Lord is talking about. And so part of what happens is that the books are very complicated, and that the complicatedness is on has its own life. So we'll talk about that in a second. But to rewind a little bit, to talk about this period that I sometimes refer to as the interregnum, that's the period after the composition of the Zohar, but before the rise of Gloria and Kabbalah. What we have is that in that period, Kabbalah spread very quickly. It was a very underground, it was a very elite, it was a very hush-hush kind of thing. That's not to say people were publishing things and talking about Kabbalistic ideas, but there was no desire to make it public. It was a very hush-hush, elite, esoteric practice, very much so. And by 1492, with the Alhambra decree, which declared that basically all Muslims and Jews had to leave Spain or convert, you have the Kabbalah transforming from being a very elite, very inner, very inward-looking, very secretive kind of thing, to the Kabbalah actually becoming imbued with a very eschatological, that's to say, it has to do with the end of the world and very messianic themes. And so in the aftermath of the disaster that was 1492, Kabbalah is going to branch out into the world. It's going to become popularized. And many of the refugees who fled from Spain, who were actually saved by a Muslim leader, which I don't know why that doesn't get more press, but it should. Bayezid II was the Muslim leader of the Ottoman Empire that basically sent his entire fleet to Spain and saved the Jews as he could. Great guy or anything, he may have been that too, but he realized that you kick all your doctors, lawyers, and scientists out of a country. Of course, he wanted them, and he was right to do it. The Ottoman Empire saw a huge boom from the importation of the refugees after the 1492 Alhambra decree. By the way, you can also notice that Spain didn't do terribly good in many ways in the aftermath of that either. So many of these Jews are going to settle in the Ottoman Empire. The places they're going to settle is going to be in Salonika and Warsaw, have traditionally known two Jewish cities in the world. And so Salonika and Greece are going to settle. But many of the Kabbalistically inclined people are actually going to move to the place they're most familiar with, at least in their sort of imaginary landscape, and that's up in the Galilee at a place called Sfat, near Meron, where Shimon Bar Yochai, the traditional author of the Zohar, was thought to be buried. And it's there at Meron and Sfat where new forms of Kabbalah begin to emerge. Kabbalah begins to be popularized. It's a very important moment in the history of Kabbalah. Teaching publicly at some level. There are classes you can take on Kabbalah. And what ends up happening is in this area, there lies a new form of highly systematized, highly intellectualized, very encyclopedic, and very symbolic, which is just to say that it's organizing all kinds of Kabbalistic ideas into something like a Kabbalistic system. That system, of course, the major one is going to be Joseph Porter. Just a moment. Of course, other forms of Kabbalah also exist at this time. We talked at length last time about but that's not part of the project. Is a project is a kind of intellectual communion with the divine, and that's and focusing in on Hebrew combination, Hebrew words, and various kinds of mantras. So they're in the milieu of the Zohar. What's going to be really important is that in the study of Kabbalah, Isaac Luria and his Chaim Vital are going to reincorporate some of Abalafia's ideas. That's going to basically say Abalafia from Aleph, Corsica, and kind of history. dies. He's going to be kind of alive. Kabbalah why? Because it's the that the 1492 Al-Hambra decree at the end. And that Kabbalah popularized the time period where Kabbalah is being opened up to the masses. Some folks, I say the masses, opened up to really elite dudes, to everybody. And there are new services invented. Drama that must have precipitated in the circle. I would have loved to see the tablets of drama, but unfortunately, a lot of that doesn't survive. We just got a rough idea about what some of these texts look like. So this is Pardes Romain. This is the main text of Joseph Cordovero. This is the central text of the Cordoverian system of Kabbalah. A rough idea about how dense it is. It's about that long. Right? So it's a substantial text. This doesn't have any commentary, by the way. It's straight text. If you want to get a sense of what this looks like inside, it's pretty dense, wall to wall. Right? Sense of what this looks like. So these texts are no joke. Pardes Romain is an incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging text to try to read. And there is no translation of this into English at all. I don't think Spanish. Sure. Many of these example of early systematization of the sacred Zohar, for example, and it's super difficult in finding English translations. Just straightforward, they don't exist. If you're going to get so, beginning of the 15th century, not only are Jews interested in Kabbalah, but Christians are too. This is a strange turn of events, but it's really important in the development of Western Christian spirituality, especially esoteric spirituality. As you, I'm sure, know, by the 15th century, there was a movement in Italy that called the Renaissance or whatever. But what we have is the arrival of a great deal of new texts that are being imported from Greece. I say new, they're actually really old texts. But they're being imported into Italy, and what's happening is that many of these old texts, they are underwriting an idea that's going on that in order to get sort of a pure intellectual reality or a pure intellectual appreciation of what's going on in the world, we need to go back in time with the original text, with the original foundations of this literature. This is sometimes called the Ad Fontes Bible, the chief source of the Bible. And what you get is a massive translation project led by people who works, for instance, Plato. Most of the Middle Ages had basically never read Plato. They had fragments of it. They had the Tooth and they have other documents. Christians. And so you have an enormous influx of new, old ideas coming in from the Greek century. The idea that was current at the time that primordial wisdom was something more reliable than what was going on in the Middle Ages. In fact, it's the Renaissance humanists are going to refer to that time period. The gods, of course, the people that destroyed the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire, and the humanists really, these people, they felt they went backwards, superstition, etc. And so there was a long idea by the Renaissance humanists that the Middle Ages basically was a mistake. All of the scholasticism, all of it was a mistake. And so what we need to do is go back to the original Latin and Greek writers and learn from the original sources, not through a bunch of commentaries, cut all that out and go back and read just the original sources. And so this ad fontes approach also included a great deal of what's going on in Jewish writing as well, because Christians believed that fundamentally Christianity emerged from Judaism and that there was a primordial wisdom to be had by and that primordial wisdom captured things that perhaps Christianity had not quite covered. And so Kabbalah fit that bill, because that's exactly what Kabbalah claims to be. It claims to be primordial wisdom given to both at some level, and it's transmitted to Shimon Bar Yochai eventually, and eventually transferred into the sacred Zohar. And so the idea is that Kabbalah was one form of this Plato and Hermes Trismegistus and these sort of figures. And so there was an idea that Kabbalah had secrets that had been preserved by the Jews, but the Jews had preserved them, but they didn't understand them. Because of course the Jews are backwards, blind people who reject the Messiah and don't understand anything. And so the idea was that the Jews had all this Kabbalah, but the Jews really didn't understand it. And so these Christians really turn their attention to the Kabbalah, and they begin to recruit non-Jews, that is to say, Jews, former Jews who have converted to Christianity, are Jews who are amenable to this sort of project. And so we have converted Jews, Christians and Trinity, and we also just Jews who are just kind of cool with learning together, folks like Yochanan and Arnon. And what ends up happening is that many of the texts of Kabbalah slowly begin to be translated from Hebrew and Latin.
Yo, babies, I'm here.
As those texts begin to get translated into
I'm just going to try to, let's see if I can fix it.
That one, there's something really, really interesting and really captivating about the Kabbalah, and two, they begin to believe that the Kabbalah actually proves the truth of Christianity. And so they make a way of accessing primordial wisdom, but also part of what is sometimes referred to as the Latin polemical, where Jewish texts are marshaled against Jews in the interest of converting. And so the Kabbalah is actually mined for all kinds of Trinitarian ideas of the three Sefirot, directly the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and all kinds of other ideas where the basic structure is that is actually a kind of mystery that Jews see it. And so what ends up happening is a lot of these texts begin to be translated from Hebrew and Aramaic into Latin, and this begins to form a time period where these early Christians are combining ideas from Plato, ideas from the Hermetic world, ideas from Hermes Trismegistus. They're beginning to combine ideas from Kabbalah. They're beginning to form synthetic versions of Christianity, as you can imagine, are pretty controversial. So Kabbalah becomes one of the admixtures by which a new kind of Christianity is beginning to emerge, and esoteric Christianity begins to emerge in the 15th century. And some of the dominant some pretty famous folks, at least in the history of cults. There's going to be folks like Giovanni
Stop with this stuff.
who's famous 900 BC,
It's looking big.
folks basically and basically Ficino thought that he, or not Ficino, thought that he had fundamentally synthesized all knowledge, Kabbalah, Pythagoreanism, everything. He thought he had systematized every form of knowledge into 900 BC. And that is what he said, I want to make people about this, and I'll show you that I'm right. And his Kabbalistic theses are among some of the earliest examples of Christian Kabbalah, the pinnacle of the book, They go at the very, very end. There's the final theses in the 900 theses, and he really, Kabbalah has really landed its multiple theses in a way that no one else has. Francesco Gior is also a deeper and systematic incorporator of Hermetic and Kabbalistic ideas into Christianity. His works are really, really difficult to access, and I don't think they can translate to English. And they are some of the earliest examples of systematic analysis of Christianity using Kabbalah as a lens. Athanasius Kircher, of course, famous German polymath, also integrated Kabbalah into his thinking, and his version of the tree of life, Time, has gone on to basically become the standard one in the Christian occult world, or the occult world more generally, folks who exist in places like the Old Dawn, in Hermetic orders. Often the form of Kabbalah they're inheriting is actually traceable back to folks like Kircher or to Johann Rothschild. Rothschild also very important scholar in Hebrew, one of the greatest scholars of Hebrew in the Renaissance. And his two works, Fictio and Kabbalistica, are systematic presentations of both Kabbalistic ideas and also Kabbalistic texts translated in their entirety into Hebrew. Many non-Jews whose first encounter with Kabbalah was almost certainly going to be a translation of Kabbalistica, and that or another version is another text is Kabbalah Devudata, the Kabbalah Unveiled by Christian Northern Rosenroth. As we see a bunch of these guys, the Germans. The Germans were pretty interested in this, and in fact, many people have made the argument that the Protestant Reformation has its origins in this kind of touch with Kabbalah. That Kabbalah is sort of the escape philosophy of the Protestant Reformation at some level needs to get away from Catholicism, and that the bridge at some level away from Catholicism, the gravitational pull away from Catholicism at some level in a very early strata was Kabbalah. Now, of course, that didn't was certainly interested in Kabbalah. All the wax. Kabbalah after this incredibly influential. Cornelius Agrippa's three books of philosophy is probably the standard text in the Renaissance philosophy and magic. All magic practitioners operate now in the West. Magic is a ritual practice. Almost certainly trace all their to Cornelius Agrippa. Three books is biblical philosophy are foundational, and Agrippa integrates Kabbalah into his thinking seamlessly. It really is deeply connected to ideas and time. So what I want to point out is that Christians are also in Kabbalah. I think I mentioned this maybe a couple times ago, that the first time that the Zohar was printed, it was printed in a single volume at Cremona at the behest of Christians. Christians wanted it. It wasn't Jews trying to get it printed. The Jewish version was printed about a year later in 3 volumes, which is standard now to print the Kabbalah. The Cremona one, just to say, Kabbalah isn't just affecting Jews. It's also deeply affecting Christians. Are also really interested in the development of Kabbalah, and what's going to end up happening is that will form a trajectory by which Christians will begin to interiorize a lot of Kabbalistic ideas, and that will, at some level, lay the foundation for what we sometimes call Western. And the practice of the occult through words written all around the periphery or whatever has to come on to Christianity and on to Christianity's more occult side. Kabbalah has its own life, and eventually comes to become a new form of Kabbalah called Hermetic Kabbalah, which is very influential in occult circles. Back to Satan, right? Let's go back to Satan. That's really the stage all this is playing out. So Moshe Ben Yaakov is going to act as all people do, and so his death in some way signaled the end of one process, one cycle of development. And I will say said that you can, in some sense, divide Kabbalistic history into two big phases. It's from the early Kabbalah and Zohar all the way to Cordovero. That's one. The rest of Kabbalah can be divided into everything after that. We are all living in the shadows of what comes next. What comes next is Gloria arrived actually in Jerusalem. He was born in Egypt. He arrived at least on the very day that Cordero died, and allegedly he saw as the funeral train was making its way to the graveyard. You can still go see Cordero's tomb in Safed. You can make your way to Cordero's tomb, and the funeral train allegedly, as like Gloria said, you saw a pillar of fire rising in front of the funeral train. Now, for folks who know some Bible, you'll recognize that image immediately. Right? That's how God appeared to Israel during the Exodus. That God appeared to Israel as a pillar of fire. And so that God appeared to before the funeral train or Pharaoh as a pillar of fire, and Gloria settled in Safed. Gloria's life prior to this whole couple years before he dies in Safed is actually relatively unremarkable. He is born, his father is young, he's raised by his maternal uncle in Egypt. His father is actually relatively wealthy guy, and he provides Gloria with a very high quality education, and Gloria obtains what seems to be an early copy of the Zohar, maybe the Mantua, the 3 volume Mantua version, and he becomes completely infatuated with it. In fact, so infatuated that he basically goes derelict. Dude, he was supposed to become a business person. He abandons that. He had married, and he just basically abandons his wife. And he kind of lives most of his days meditating out in a hut near the Nile. And it's during those years, those 15 or some odd years of him meditating on the Nile in this hut that he built for himself, and it seems to form it at some point, he has a kind of mystical breakthrough. I mean, allegedly heralded by a life of a prophet, results in the have now grown up with Gloria. Born the life of the prophet and his father's son. At any rate, they would eventually make his way back to Jerusalem, and then eventually make his way to Safed, arriving, as I said, on the day of Cordero's death. And he would spend a couple of years there, just a couple of years, probably 2 or 3 years, and he died before he turned 40. This is one of the guys that, the flame burns twice as bright, only learns half as long. This guy burned out. He was just such a demanding individual, and his ideas were shocking. Well, with Cordero dead, many people, I think, didn't believe that Cordero was the Messiah that he died. The real because one of them that but when Cordero died, there was the idea that no Cordero maybe kind of like Elijah died. And the time Gloria fit into that perfectly. Gloria began to teach Kabbalah basically every day. Introductory level Kabbalah class that comes to Gloria's Kabbalah Academy, Intro Kabbalah. He also began to develop an inner circle of people that he began to teach his own ideas to. The inner circle composed of several students. We know about those students. And what's weird is that we seem to have taught different versions of things to students. And we know that because they say so, that some people are allowed some things, some people are allowed others, and some people have some things, some people have others. And you can see this in the publications because, for instance, one of Gloria's students, Israel Saru, doesn't get credit but Israel Saru, one of the earliest publishers of Chaim. And it's like Gloria's work popularize them. And so a big part of what's like Gloria is that Gloria really wants to create his sort of general program. He believes in a very intense that kind of is going to prove to be a disaster. So missing servers almost always turns into disaster. And anyway, he began to build a core of people. And then he died. He died. He died like 2 years into being a son. And so his death wasn't, he was always kind of sickly, so his death wasn't completely shocking. But after his death, his two most important students would be Israel Saruga, I mentioned a moment ago, and the other, of course, the much more important student, at least historically, Paul. And it's going to be Chaim Vital's interpretation of the ideas of the Arizal, of Itzhak Luria, that are going to accompany him. The Arizal himself, Itzhak Luria basically wrote a couple of lyrics. He didn't really write much. He taught, and his students sort of synthesized documents. There's a long tradition of this. Buddha never wrote anything down. Jesus never wrote anything down. Muhammad couldn't read or write. There's a whole long tradition of people, Socrates never wrote anything. There's a whole long tradition of people who don't write things down and yet the world. So if you really want to change the world, don't write books. Writing books is a surefire way, and don't write anything. Just talk to people. And if you talk to people and charismatic enough, they will do all the writing for you. And and again, it's like Gordon was only there in something for 2 or 3 years, and he managed to make this decisive through his students. So you know about this Luria and Kabbalah. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to be able to systematically go through every part of it because it is incredibly difficult and heroic and it's detailed. But the main thing to know about it is that as Cordovero was moving in a much more rationalistic, much more intellectualistic, much more systematic direction when it comes to trying to unpack the ideas of the Zohar, Luria is much more interested on the mythos of the Zohar. He's much more interested in the evolving process Zohar seems to describe about how God goes from being infinitely recently present in the world. And so Luria's main shift is it's going to shift away from systematically analyzing every reality that was constructed, but rather focus on the dynamic unfolding of reality and the mythology of that unfolding. And it's the mythology, I don't mean falseness or as monsters and myth, but it's the doing the entire drama of the unfolding of reality as we know it in the past. It's always present to us. So in the unfolding universe, be it the center of it's happened back then, it's happened now, so at some level it's kind of happening. The future's kind of reaching for us to rename us. And so even notions like time become very weird in the Lurianic system. So what we get is that he's primarily interested in what I might call the mythological structure, the genesis of reality in its development, as that development is comprehensible at any given moment in the development of humanity or of God. For Luria, the development of God and the development of humanity are the same development. His system, as far as we have it, is a really highly developed system of analyzing reality. I can't say that it's always terribly coherent, and I certainly can't say that I always understand it. But what he's focused on, what his core idea is what often is called the order of development or the order of evolution. This is often referred to as the Seder Ishtachalut, the order of evolution. In fact, Ishtachalut is actually a modern word for evolution, like the winning evolution. So it's evolution of reality. Now, just again, use evolutionary ideas, evolutionary models that at some level biological entities contain the past inside you. That is to say that you contain all kinds of things in your DNA from what we used to be. We're not apes like they used for us. We contain DNA fragments of those things. The past is still with us. Or as Bill Faulkner said, that the past is dead, it's not even past. And that's true also for Luria and Kabbalah. The idea is yes, there were things that happened in the primordial past, the primordial past, but those things are occurring to us now, which is still happening. And so what we get is that there is a sort of spiraling cycle of, that is to say, the world is coming into being, the world is emerging as such, it's always emerging as such, and further right, it's also regressing, it's also going back to the way it was. So there is an incredible dynamism in the learning system where you don't know quite where you are in time, in space. You don't quite know where you are even in righteousness sometimes. There's a kind of constant movement to and fro where the world is, on the one hand, becomes exiled, on the other hand, becoming redeemed. And so the learning system, part of what makes it so difficult is that at the heart of the system is this dialectical structure where everything is happening all at once and everything is also being erased all at once. And so it's difficult to figure out at what moment something is happening, because at every moment, everything's always happening. And so knowing exactly what's going on in the system is very complicated, because the system is so dynamic. It's almost like a fractal. Like the more you zoom in on a region of the fractal, the more the entire fractal reproduces for you. And so the system is very, very fractalized. And so it's all difficult to know exactly what's going on. But let's go over some of the core ideas of this Equilibrium. The big first is concept of Simpson. Simpson was an idea that was developed by Cordero, actually, factor of Equilibrium. So Cordero had to solve a problem. The problem is, well, how do we get from God, whose light reaches every metaphysical, ontological aspect of reality? God's being is infinite, and so it must occupy every point with that infinity. How do you get to an idea that there's a gap? How do you get the idea there's a place where God isn't in order for the world to exist? Because it can't be the case that God is completely in fullness, and the system's full, and you can't have a world. You can't have people of the moment. You can't have the world. So God has to create an emptiness, a divine emptiness, a vacuum. And what God does is God tracks some region of God's self, or it's like a region, but again, the spatial concepts are not accurate. But God ontologically tracks God's self, and that ontological contraction creates a void. And that void is both surrounded by God, it's not God, it's a kind of gap, it's a kind of void or a vacuum. I can always imagine like when you have to like, I don't know, you gain a couple pounds and you need to get in some old pants, and so you like suck your belly in and tighten your belt real tight. It's like God sucking in God. Built on. I don't know how to. So God creates this Simpson, and into that Simpson, that void, into that contraction, that will be where the Olamot appears. The Olamot are the forms that comprise our reality. Yes. We just don't. It's just we're fine. We do not have access to God in this. And so what we do have access to is what's left. God it's like a laser. God concentrates some of God's light, and that finitized light, that finitized existence of God, to enter into the and when it enters the void, it as into the void, it begins to weaken, so to speak. And as it begins to weaken, as it teeters down into the void, as it flows down into the void, it begins to weaken. And as it weakens, there are strategic parts, or the decisive parts into the void, just like you're shining a laser, right? It's the wider it gets, and the more it begins to break down, it begins to fade away. God shoots that light out of it so hard, and it goes in and begins to break down. And as it breaks down into four distinct realms. And those four distinct realms are the fundamental structures of reality. The first one is Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is the primeval body of God. It's the way that we imagine God. It's when you think of God as a person, what you're imagining is Adam Kadmon. It's the first evil glimpse of God as a being. Because before that, God is just infinite light. God's the first glimpse is out of Kadmon, sort of like a negative image of God broadcast into the Lord. The next layer down of nation, then down further is the world of Beriah, right? Where God is becoming more and more concretized, not yet physical, but more and more concretized. And then we get to the world of formation, where God is recognizable. And then finally we get down to the world of Asa. And we are actually in a subject world of Asa. And that sometimes is called the five world or the four world, because our physical reality is distinct from all other four worlds in the world of Asa. So the four worlds, the Olamot, are the ontological registers of reality. And what Luria imagines, and the reason why he imagines these four worlds, is that every single time there is a movement within the Godhead, an evolution in the Godhead, a change in the Godhead, that change has to be understood as a logical, dialectical progression of how God is mutating, how God is changing. With every time God interacts with something, that image of God, that aspect of God alters. And so what we get in the world of the various registers of reality, we get entirely different branches of the sphere. Now, I might pull this up and we get to the Q&A later. Is that one thing that makes the organic system so mind-boggling complicated is that every register of reality has its own subtle structure. And inside of every spherot is more spherot. And so there are spherot inside of spherot inside of spherot. There are spherot on the backside of Ra, which is this Achra, the eagle. It is again, for folks who are familiar with mathematics, it's like a fractal. That anytime you zoom in on any register of reality, you begin to see this entire system of reality reproduced over and over and over and over again. And you have these enormously complex, what are called Villanot or tree systems. And those really complex Villanot or tree systems describe the various spherot as they interact with each other as these various registers of reality. We can't go into the various levels of reality at time, but each one of them is distinct, and each one of them is a moment in the development of the Godhead. Now, some folks who have some background in philosophy, folks who have some background perhaps in Hegel, this is going to sound really familiar because if you ever read the logic, the progression of the logic in Hegel, Hegel actually commends Kabbalah as prefiguring his logic. Now, I'm not sure if that's an indictment of Kabbalah or not, so I don't know much of Hegel, but Hegel's system of the unfolding of reality is deeply influenced by the Lurianic sort of folding out structure of reality. Now, as God's light begins to travel through the very structures that emerge to hold God in the very moment of the divine, as it gets further and further into the void, the very structure, they're just too far away. It's just like, I don't know, it's like it's a moment where you feel yourself, you're holding on to something right, and you feel yourself, it's a moment where you just let go. And that let go moment, the moment when the vessels that hold God's life, because they've gotten so far away from source, they don't have enough energy, they don't have enough dynamism, they don't have enough of tesuk, they don't have enough strength to hold God's light, and they shatter. And that shattering pulls in, they overpower the vessels, right? And they shatter. It's like putting you take a real glass vessel and pour really hot water in it, right? Or you feel any better. But imagine, right, hot water being poured into an ice cold vessel. The ice cold vessel is the vacuum shatter. And that shattering forms what are called shards. And these shards of the exact get off of it. So, right? You took pure curiosity, which is a pretty good trait, and broke it off and made it its own thing. Pure curiosity is a disaster because it's not going to happen to people, right? pure love. Take it away and put it checks at all. Kabbalists recognize that the shards of the divine code can be rectified by engaging in the magic course, part of it too, by having the right kavanah, by having the right concentration, by having the right intention, by doing the Jewish law with absolute intention, purity of heart, by performing things like Shabbat, putting tefillin on, by observing the fast of Yom or whatever. All these things help to repair reality. They fake reality, infer Messiah, because for the learning system, the act of reparation, the act of repairing the world, begins to sort of build the world in which the Messiah can emerge. And at some level, you can imagine that Messiah is kind of the keystone of the entire process. The Messiah is the person who will turn the key. We will build the world worthy of Messiah, and Messiah will come and turn the key, and they will unfurl the final redemption. And so it's by repairing the world that we prepare the world for the possibility of Messiah. And this idea is going to have enormous impact in the history of Judaism. If you've ever hung out with folks in the Chabad Lubavitch movement, I don't know if folks have ever been around Chabad people who, you light candles, felon, you can, be walking around New York and I'll have a Chabad guy like on the side of the street, like, hey, you put the felon on today? I'm like, no. You put the felon on now. Why would they bother you on the street to put the felon on? It's not because they're trying to do you a favor. They're trying to engage into their life. They think that every Jew, whatever that means to them, who can engage in the process of doing Islam and put the felon on will usher in the days of the Messiah that much more clearly. And so they're trying at some level to accelerate, right? One can think about Kabbalistic ideas or alluding to Kabbalah, the kind of Jewish accelerationism. The world is broken and they're trying to accelerate the process by which it's repaired. You accelerate that process by engaging in spiritual warfare against the code and by binding and then repairing the clean load in a way that allows you to basically accelerate the process by which the Messiah comes. And if you read Chaim Vital, he really does think that he definitely thinks he's the Messiah. He just thinks that he has to be a little bit more righteous. If he can just be a little more righteous, just think about that woman right, when he was praying. If you just didn't think that dirty thought, if you just memorized a little bit more Mishnah, that he would have been revealed as the Messiah. He would have emerged as the Messiah. This is idea you see him constantly in his journals. He's Chaim Vital simultaneously manages to be both incredibly self-deprecating and also incredibly arrogant. I guess that tends to go hand in hand. But sometimes he's I'm not worthy, I'm unworthy of anything. I'm the lowest of the low. And it's like, yeah, if I've just done this, I've been the Messiah. So the idea is that the Messiah is right around the corner. It's the result of this process. Now, of course, that idea got retrofitted into liberal Jewish circles for social justice, but in classical Kabbalistic world, it has everything to do with strict obedience to Another key innovation in the Lurianic system is that Luria is really obsessed with some of the more bizarre sections of the Zohar. There are three sections of the Zohar that are notoriously difficult to understand. Two of them are the Introt, the assemblies, and the final is a section called Sifra Ditzniuta. And Sifra Ditzniuta is a relatively brief section of the Zohar that contains a long description of God's beard. And then there's another section that also contains descriptions of God's beard, but also God's face in general. And no one's really sure what in the world's going on in those sections. They're really, really weird. Weird even compared to the other sections of Zohar. Zohar is weird enough, but it's like weird on weird. And it's like Luria develops a systematization of this idea of the movements within the divine face. That the divine face is actually reflective of metaphysical changes in reality. And that the divine face are the countenances of parts of theme, that these parts of theme are arrangements of the Sphirot, and those arrangements of the Sphirot are indicators of certain kinds of changes and developments within the divine. I will go ahead and say this, the parts of theme is without a doubt the most complicated part of the entire structure of Lurianic Kabbalah. Because it's analyzing the Sphirot in terms of how they're arranged and how the various systems relate to themselves internally. And it is just completely difficult to understand. I still struggle trying to figure out, I know what the various configurations are, I know what Ima and or whatever, I know what the structures look like, but when you begin to analyze how they move and change in relation to other mystical stuff going on in the RSL system, it just becomes amazing. So I have a real difficult time keeping track of what's going on in this inner development of the Godhead. But what's important to note is that for Luria, God is not a thing, God is a process. And God is changing all the time. And so when God tells to Moshe Rabbeinu, right, I'll be what I'll be, Luria takes that really seriously. Yeah, God is changing. God is a process. God is not a thing, God is a process. And that process is reality. And we are part of that process. And just like you get angry, so does God. And just like you get, compassionate, so does God. And that the change of God from angry to compassion, or the change from a normal state of affairs to being angry, that change in your emotions can be mapped. And so, for God, a change in God's emotional life can be mapped. And those mappings of God's emotional psychology or intellectual psychology are very complicated part of the inner psychology, inner divine psychology. It's really complicated. Also, famously, it's like Luria is going to reintroduce the concept of reincarnation into Judaism. Reincarnation is an idea that never really took hold for people who don't believe it at some point, but most of the larger economic faiths have rejected reincarnation for various reincarnations. In fact, most major work is Chaim, most systematic account of Isaac Luria's philosophy. This is of glorious philosophy by Simon Tong, and this is the standard now 2-volume text on reincarnation by Simon Tong's teachings of Encyclopedia on reincarnation, case of reincarnation. So, reincarnation is an idea that's reintroduced into Judaism. It may have existed earlier in some ways, but certainly Paul really introduced it via Encyclopedia. And the idea is that every single person has what they call a soul root. And the soul root is a kind of aspect of your soul. There are 5 different layers of your soul according to the Orionic system. And some of those parts of your soul go all the way back to the beginning of all creation. And various people have had that soul. You are like a root. You are a root. And there are things growing off the root. You're one of the things growing off the root. And there are many people prior to you that have had the same soul as you. Now, the bad thing about that is they've committed all kinds of sins that you're now responsible for fixing. Because again, remember, the Glorious system is dynamic. Just because you engage in 2 good once, it doesn't mean that you didn't do bad stuff before. If you did bad stuff, well, you break the Jewish law, that further damages reality. And so there have been people in the past that have really damaged reality. Maybe in the past life did something really bad. By the way, the soul root was Cain, the first murderer. And so as you can imagine, this soul root was Cain had a lot to fix. It was the literal origin of murder in the world. And so he had to undergo all kinds of what are called tikkunim, reparations, and these reparations include everything from ascetic practices to reading certain part of the Bible, to mystical practices. And so the idea is that not only are you responsible for you being good you have to make up for all the things that have happened prior to you. So every person that's had your soul prior to you, you are now responsible for figuring out how to fix all the bad things that you did. Because all the bad things are still there. You have the most apt to fix them. Now, how do you figure that out? You go to a mystic, a Kabbalist, and the Kabbalist will tell you who your soul root is, and they will tell you all the bad things that you've done, and they will give you tikkunim and how to fix them. Tikkunim could be anything from extra prayers to amulets to fasting. There are all kinds of tikkunim. If you ever go to Sfat, if you ever go to Safed to this day, you can go to Kabbalists. I've seen signs in Safed where they will go and they will figure out who your soul is. And they're alleged experts who know how to do this. I don't know how to do this, but I'll give it to them. That's fine. And they can figure out who your soul root is, and they will tell you your soul root was Lamech. And you have to make this sins, and you are inherited these sins. These are the kind of tikkunim that you can do, reparation you can do to fix the sins of your past lives. Reincarnation has entered into Judaism completely intact, and it is a completely viable way of thinking about your afterlife. It's not all, it's very normative at this point. And so, reincarnation with the rise of the Vedic Kabbalah is fixing the lives. In a way that I don't think it is in Christianity and Islam. I think in Christianity and Islam, if you want to believe in reincarnation, you don't want to make a big deal of it. I think if you make a big deal of it, you're going to put everything in trouble. Whereas Judaism, reincarnation is completely normalized. Completely normalized. Now, I say it's normalized, but it's only normalized within the system of Vedic Kabbalah, where you want to find out what your reincarnation is of, you need to do the work of fixing all the sins. All the paths in your past life. Now, you do also earn the merit of your past life, but you also earn all the bad stuff too. This idea that the soul can survive death can be reborn. Also, it means that various other regions of the soul, again, you have 5 regions of your soul. Some other regions of your soul can actually survive death and become detached from the other regions. And those detached parts of your soul, if you committed a lot of sins in your life, you become addicted to those sins. And those that aspect of your soul that becomes addicted to those sins actually can roam around and want to continue committing sins in the next life. This is especially true of sexual sins, but also gluttony and drunkenness and stuff. And so, if you were a lecherous, drunken, bad person, then if you become addicted to those things, when you die, your soul will become so polluted that it will become detached from your other souls, and it will run around. And what does it want to do? It wants to continue doing what it did, getting drunk and having sex or whatever. And so what it will do is it will try to attach itself to other people because you can't really get drunk and have sex if you're just a soul, so you got to get attached to someone else. And so when your soul attaches, your evil soul attaches itself to the people, the word for to attach in Hebrew is dalah, right? In fact, the modern Hebrew word for glue comes from the same root word. your soul tabach. It clings to other people, and that soul that clings to other people, that system, this is the origin of the divik. The divik is the evil version of your soul, it's the evil aspect of your soul that roams around and tries to something people. And the very earliest exorcism stories that we have in Judaism are actually from Satan. In fact, you taught a whole class of your possession of Judaism. And if you want to learn more about this, I have some episodes on my YouTube channel as well. But what you have here is like possession is not the right word. It's actually an evil dead person doing possessing. And so Dibuk can become a big deal in the Kabbalistic world as well. But the opposite is true too. The soul of very righteous people hangs around near their grave. If you need to get some spiritual chizuk, some righteousness, let's say that you're traveling somewhere and you know that your old paramour is going to be there and you don't want to hook up with them. This is a real example, by the way. You don't want to hook up with them, be married, whatever, do adultery. That's bad. So what do? You go into a graveyard of a righteous person, and you lay on the grave of the righteous person, and you meditate on their soul, and invite their soul into your soul, and they will impregnate you. This is called Yibor, and the soul of the righteous dead person will impregnate your soul with a little bit of their righteousness, and it will give you enough of enough of righteousness that when you go to face this spiritual challenge of committing adultery, you won't do it. Because it's like a shot in the arm, a shot in the soul from the righteous person, and the righteous person will give you the spiritual power to overcome your failure, your sin, and then they will come back to their grave and they'll come back. For folks who know a little about Buddhism, right, it sounds a bit like bodhisattvas, right? The idea that there are people who are enlightened in the Buddhist tradition. They become so enlightened, they don't become completely enlightened, so they can stick around here to help the rest of us schmucks. Right? So bodhisattvas, they don't leave, they don't go to Nirvana, they stay here to help the rest of us get a little bit more enlightened. And so these tzedakkim, these righteous people, you can go lay on their graves, and you can get a little bit of spiritual power from their soul, and will go into your soul and help you. People do this to this day. It's a problem, actually, that people get caught sneaking into graveyards and lying on graves to get soul power. Soul power is a cool subject. So at any rate, so this idea of Dibur becomes a big idea as well. So Dibur, right, evil souls becoming attached to your body. They can also get animals, by the way. They don't like to be an animal. Apparently it's not good in there, but they want to get people. And Chaim Vital, by the way, also became one of the earliest exorcists in this whole tradition. By the way, he failed. He also get the Dibuk to leave, and then as soon as the Dibuk left, he will come back and repossess the person and kill him. And so there's all kinds of great Dibuk stories. If you've never seen the movie The Dibuk, it's one of the great classics of Yiddish film. It was filmed in the 30s. In fact, immediately before the film died. And so it's really, I think they remastered it and they bring down the Yiddish subtitles. And if you've ever seen The Dibuk, it's a great film from the 30s. It's a classic example of Yiddish theater and which the Yiddish filmmaking is. Probably the crowning achievement before it all went to hell and Hollywood. But The Dibuk is a classic movie. We're getting close to Halloween time. It's the Jewish Halloween. Movie watching, watch The Dibuk. So the Dibuk is an idea that emerges also from Rabbinic Kabbalah, but also as I said a minute ago, Rabbinic Kabbalah becomes just Kabbalah. If you've ever studied Kabbalah, you've heard this term, Tikkun Olam, right? You've heard of the world of Atzilut, the world of Asiyah. You know that the soul has there's a Yechida and a Neshama and a Ruach and all the various parts of the soul. Rabbinic Kabbalah just became Kabbalah. It absorbed all other previous forms of Kabbalah, whether it's Abraham Abalaski's Kabbalah, whether it's Cordero's Kabbalah, whether it was other forms of Kabbalah that absorbed them all, in some ways transcended them all. It abolished them all and it ascended above them all. And by both eliminating all of them and then conglomerating all of them into one thing, it became beautiful. And that beautiful thing basically has become Jewish theology. If you've ever read books of Jewish theology, modern books of Jewish theology, they're almost always derivative of its Kabbalah. And that's true of Hasidic people. That's true of Messianic people, opponents of the Hasidic people. That's true of hardcore Jewish rationalists, like, the Vilna Gaon, right? The hardcore rational guy. Also hardcore Kabbalist. Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah, is at some level just Jewish theology. Now, what's ironic about that, we'll talk about this more as we wrap the class up in a few weeks, why aren't these texts available then? If at some level, Tikkun Olam and all these ideas are just basically now part of our theological landscape of Judaism, why is it that you just can't go buy a copy of Basic Science in English? Why is it you can't just go buy a copy of Parties for a Meme in English? Why is it that the entire 15-volume our collected works are not translated in English? There's a reason for that. And we'll get to that in a few weeks. There is a really important reason for why that is. It has everything to do with liberal Judaism. How liberal Judaism decanonized Kabbalah. It was rejected. That's part of what made liberal modern Judaism is the amputation of Kabbalah from Judaism. Now that's changing, but it's not changing in the right way. Because the way it's changing is not. It's changing in the sense that Kabbalah's getting imported. They're being imported haphazardly. And the original texts are not being consulted, and they're not being really translated. And so modern Jews who are interested in Kabbalah don't have access to the original texts. And that's a disaster. It's a real disaster. I mean, you can imagine if, if the works of Thomas Aquinas just weren't translated in English. You had to rely on old Latin musicians and stuff like that would be a mess. Well, that's just basically what happens. It's as if Thomas Aquinas had the influence he did in the Catholic world, that no Catholics have access to his actual works in English. A reliable, it's a mess. It's a real mess. So, and again, this is the standard volume of Basic Science in Hebrew. There's no translation. We'll talk about why there's just not one. It's a mess. It's a bad situation. So, at the end of the day, it's like Gloria's version of Kabbalah. It wins. Now, I'm not saying it's completely systematic, and I'm not saying it's completely all worked out. There's still a bunch of kinks in the system. But at the end of the day, the 15-volume collected works of the Arizal, really the works of Chaim Vital, systematizing the works of some level of Arizal, that becomes Jewish theology. Now, on the one hand, that's really cool, because Kabbalah won. On the other hand, it's a disaster, because most Jews who are interested in Kabbalah, at least in the non-Orthodox schools, have no access to it. It's a mess. This is a real problem. I don't know how it's going to get solved, but it's just now in the past 10 years that the entire Zohar has been translated reliably in English. So this is a big problem. We'll talk about this problem. We'll talk about why we're in this boat and how we're going to get out of it in a few weeks. But it may just, in our lifetime, we may be getting out of that problem. It may take our entire lifetime to get out of this problem. We'll talk about where it came from, why does that take our lifetime. 6 years after Chaim Vital died, the greatest articulator of the Lurianic system in Kabbalah, 6 years after he dies, a guy is born in Asia Minor, Turkey, Izmir. He's born on Tish B'Av. He's born on Tish B'Av, which happens to fall on Shabbat that year. And there's a long-standing idea in Jewish lore that the Messiah was born on the saddest day of the year. That the day of the year that we were born, every bad thing that's ever happened to us. The great hope is that on that day, the Messiah will be born. That in the future, Tish B'Av will no longer be a sad day. It will be a glorious day, because that will be the birthday of the Messiah. On Saturday of Tish B'Av, 6 years after the death of Chaim Vital, Shabbatai Tzvi is born. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Kabbalah, because he's going to become the Messiah. And not just become the Messiah. When I say that, I mean the majority of the world's Jews are convinced that he's the Messiah. He convinced the world's Jews that he was the Messiah via his publicist of Gaza using Kabbalah. And he will become the Messiah. In fact, in many ways, if you think about Judaism as a religion, in some ways, has formed Shabbatai Tzvi actively. And Shabbatai Tzvi is going to transform Judaism. He's going to transform so much of what's happening. And so what we're going to do is he's going to basically shake Judaism at its core. Because as you probably know, he will declare himself the Messiah. The vast majority of Jews believe that he's the Messiah. Many of them literally have their bags packed on the docks in Amsterdam, ready to go back home to Israel to live the Messianic age. And in 1666, he converts to Islam. And it is a titanic disaster. Prior to the Holocaust, there's been no greater disaster than the Shabbatai Tzvi. No greater disaster. And from a theological point of view, it's impossible. So, in many ways, right, you think about Shabbatai Tzvi as a full problem. And imagine most of us here heard the idea that you can't study Kabbalah until you're 40. I'm sure folks have heard that idea. Well, notice that it's like Gloria died before he was 40. Clearly, he was studying Kabbalah before he was 40. Where do ideas like that come from? They come in the aftermath. Because the idea of Kabbalah is so dangerous that they can lead the entire Jewish world into a disaster. And that disaster, Kabbalistic disaster, will be heralded by Shabbatai Tzvi, false Messiah. We will turn to him and his arguments for his Messiah next time. Shabbatai Tzvi. And also Frankincense. Frankincense is a derivative of Shabbatai Tzvi. So turn our attention to Shabbatai Tzvi and what is mystical heresy. Is Kabbalah gone off the rails? So we will deal with Shabbatai Tzvi and his so-called messianism. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden of Jewish and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work, I'm providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics like Kabbalah, alchemy, and the cult, magic, primitive philosophy. Consider supporting my work on Patreon, or perhaps with a one-time donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane
Got yourself.
and religion.